The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Elizabeth McKenna wiped sweat from her brow, the fabric of her faded cotton dress clinging to her shoulders. 3 months had passed since James's funeral, and the McKenna ranch felt larger and lonelier with each passing day. The cattle needed tending, the fence posts required mending, and the banknote grew heavier in her pocket with every sunrise. "Just get through today," she whispered to herself, the same prayer she'd repeated since that terrible morning when she'd found James trampled by spooked horses. At 28, she'd never imagined herself a widow, fighting to keep a piece of land that seemed determined to break her spirit. The barn loomed ahead, its weathered wood planks grey from years of desert storms. Elizabeth pushed open the heavy door, expecting to find the familiar smell of hay and leather. Instead, the metallic scent of blood hit her nostrils like a physical blow. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dim interior. There, collapsed against a pile of feed sacks in the far corner, lay a man unlike any she'd ever seen this close. His copper skin glistened with perspiration, and blood from a deep gash across his left shoulder. Long black hair, streaked with dust and dried blood, fell across his face. Despite his unconscious state, his muscular frame spoke of strength and endurance, broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist, powerful arms that had clearly known both labor and warfare. A breechcloth and leather leggings were his only clothing, along with moccasins that had seen hard travel. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Apache. She'd heard the stories, seen the fear in her neighbors' eyes when they spoke of raids and scalping parties. The cavalry had been hunting Apache bands for months after the latest outbreak of violence near Tucson. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fetch Sheriff Morrison from town, to alert the neighbors. This man represented everything the settlers feared most about this harsh land. Yet as she stood frozen in the doorway, something held her back. He was wounded, maybe dying. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. A crude bandage made from what looked like strips of his own shirt was wrapped around his shoulder, but blood had seeped through, staining the makeshift dressing dark red. Elizabeth found herself taking a step closer, then another. In the dim light, she could see his face clearly now. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, features that would have been considered handsome in any culture. But it was something else that stopped her cold. He looked young, maybe her own age, and in his unconscious state, vulnerable in a way that clashed with every story she'd heard about Apache warriors. "What are you doing, Lizzie?" she whispered to herself, using the pet name James had always called her. "This is madness." But her feet continued moving forward. She knelt beside the wounded man, close enough now to see the intricate beadwork on his leather armbands, the silver concho belt around his waist that caught what little light filtered through the barn's gaps. This wasn't some savage from the Penny Dreadfuls. This was a human being bleeding and in pain. As if sensing her presence, his eyes fluttered open. Elizabeth gasped and started to pull back, but found herself captured by his gaze. Dark brown eyes, almost black, stared up at her with a mixture of wariness and surprise. For a long moment neither moved. He tried to speak, his voice barely a rasp. "Water." The word was heavily accented but unmistakably English. Elizabeth's surprise must have shown on her face, because something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes before pain clouded them again. "You speak English," she whispered. He nodded slightly, the effort clearly costing him. "Some. Learned from missionary." Elizabeth glanced toward the barn door, then back at the wounded warrior. Every rational thought told her to leave him and ride to town for help, but rationality seemed to have abandoned her the moment she'd looked into those dark eyes. "You're hurt badly," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Cavalry," he managed, his breathing growing more labored. "Found our camp at dawn." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Elizabeth knew about the dawn raids, the military's preferred method of dealing with Apache resistance. She'd heard the soldiers boasting in town about successful engagements, but she'd never thought much about the human cost. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 2 days, maybe 3. His eyes fought to stay focused on her face. "Thought I would die here." Elizabeth made her decision in that instant, though she couldn't have explained why to save her life. "Not if I can help it." She rose quickly and moved to the water barrel near the barn entrance, filling a tin cup and returning to kneel beside him. Supporting his head with one hand, she brought the cup to his lips. He drank gratefully, some of the water spilling down his chin. "What's your name?" she asked softly. He studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust her with this piece of himself. Finally he spoke. "Aiyana. It means eternal blossom. Aiyana, she repeated, the unfamiliar syllables feeling strange on her tongue. I'm Elizabeth McKenna. Elizabeth, he said carefully, his pronunciation making her name sound almost musical. You are not afraid? The question hung in the air between them. Was she afraid? Terrified would be more accurate, but not of him, she realized with surprise. She was afraid of what helping him might cost her, afraid of what her neighbors would think, afraid of the consequences if the cavalry came looking. But looking down at his wounded, exhausted form, she felt something stronger than fear. I should be, she admitted, but I'm not. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps even gratitude. Your husband, where is he? Dead, she said simply. 3 months now. Aiyana's eyes softened with what looked like genuine sympathy. I am sorry. It is hard to be alone. The unexpected kindness in his voice nearly undid her composure. When was the last time anyone had offered her genuine sympathy? The neighbors had brought casseroles and hollow condolences, but they'd also whispered about how she'd never manage the ranch alone, how she should sell and move back east where a woman belonged. Yes, she whispered, it is. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising one of the brief but violent storms common to the territory. Elizabeth glanced up at the barn's roof, checking for leaks, then back at Aiyana. I need to clean that wound properly, she said, surprising herself with her decisiveness, and get you somewhere more comfortable than the floor. Aiyana's eyes searched her face. Why? Why help me? Elizabeth considered the question, looking down at this warrior who should have been her enemy, but somehow wasn't. Because it's the right thing to do, because you're hurt and alone, and I know what that feels like. Your people, they would not understand. No, she agreed quietly, they wouldn't, and still you, and still I will. The first drops of rain began pattering on the barn roof as Elizabeth rose to gather supplies. Whatever madness had taken hold of her, whatever consequences awaited, she'd committed herself now. In a land where mercy was often seen as weakness, she'd chosen compassion over fear. As she moved about the barn, collecting clean rags and checking her limited supply of medical herbs, she could feel Aiyana's eyes following her movements. 2 wounded souls, she thought, brought together by circumstances neither could have foreseen. The storm was coming, in more ways than one. The storm unleashed its fury, just as Elizabeth finished gathering her supplies. Rain hammered the barn roof with violent intensity, while lightning split the darkening sky beyond the gaps in the weathered walls. She was grateful for the noise. It would mask any sounds from the barn should curious neighbors venture out. We need to get you cleaned up, she said, kneeling beside Aiyana with a basin of water, clean cloth strips and a small bottle of whiskey James had kept for medicinal purposes. This is going to hurt. Aiyana nodded, his jaw already set with determination. I have known pain. Elizabeth began by carefully removing the crude bandage from his shoulder. The wound was deeper than she'd first realized. A rifle ball had torn through the muscle, leaving a jagged gash that had festered slightly during his days in the barn. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but Aiyana must have read something in her face. Bad? He asked. I've seen worse, she lied, remembering the hunting accidents she'd helped James treat over the years. But it needs proper cleaning. As she poured whiskey over the wound, Aiyana's body went rigid, his hands clenching into fists. But he made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. Elizabeth found herself admiring his stoicism, even as she winced in sympathy. You're very brave, she murmured, dabbing at the cleaned wound with gentle strokes. Not brave, he managed through gritted teeth. Just Apache. As she worked, Elizabeth became acutely aware of their proximity. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, and she couldn't help but notice the powerful muscles of his chest and arms, marked here and there with old scars that spoke of a life lived on the edge of violence. She'd never been this close to any man besides James, and certainly never to someone so fundamentally different from her own world. Tell me about your people, she said, partly to distract him from the pain, but mostly because she found herself genuinely curious. Aiyana was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his voice soft despite the strain. We call ourselves ND, Apache. That is what others call us. We follow the old ways, live with the land, not against it. Where is your family? Pain flickered across his features that had nothing to do with his wound. Dead, killed in the raid 2 months ago. My wife, my son. Elizabeth's hands stilled. Oh, Aiyana, I'm so sorry. Your soldiers, they came at dawn. We thought we were safe in the high country, But someone told them where to find us. His voice carried a bitterness that made Elizabeth's chest ache. My boy was only 4 winters old. He liked to collect smooth stones from the creek. The grief in his voice was raw, fresh, and Elizabeth recognized it intimately. What was his name? Nalnish. It means, he is working. He was always busy, always into everything. A ghost of a smile crossed Aiyana's features. Like a magpie, chattering and curious. Elizabeth continued cleaning the wound, but her movements had gentled even further. And your wife? Desba. Beautiful Desba, with hair like a raven's wing and laughter like water over stones. His eyes closed, and for a moment his face looked carved from stone. I was hunting when they came. When I returned, he didn't finish, but Elizabeth could imagine the horror he'd found. She'd heard the soldiers' stories, their casual recounting of successful raids. She'd never thought much about the families destroyed, the children who would never grow up, the women who would never laugh again. I'm sorry, she whispered again, knowing the words were inadequate but having nothing else to offer. Why? The question caught her off guard. Why am I sorry? Your people killed mine, yet you tend my wounds, you show kindness. Why? Elizabeth considered the question as she began wrapping his shoulder with clean bandages. Because grief is grief no matter who feels it. Because you loved them, and love is something I understand. You loved your husband. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Very much. We were going to have children, build something lasting here. She secured the bandage with gentle hands, but the horses spooked during a thunderstorm, and James, he couldn't get out of the way in time. So we are both alone. Yes. Thunder crashed overhead and both of them looked up instinctively. When their eyes met again, something had shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared loss and unexpected understanding. The bandage. It is good, Aiyana said, testing the movement of his arm carefully. You have knowledge of healing. My mother was the closest thing to a doctor in our town back in Ohio. She taught me what she could before I married James. Elizabeth gathered the soiled bandages, trying to ignore the way his praise warmed her. You need rest and food. Real food, not whatever you've been surviving on. I cannot. Your neighbors, if they see... They won't. The Hendersons are 2 miles north, the Carters 3 miles south. In this storm, no one's going anywhere. She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. I have a small room off the kitchen where I store preserves. You'd be safer there than in the barn. Aiyana struggled to sit up, then attempted to rise. His legs buckled, and Elizabeth quickly moved to support him, slipping her arm around his waist. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her. He was solid and warm, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. Lean on me, she said, her voice slightly breathless. Together they made their way slowly from the barn to the house, the rain soaking them both within seconds. Elizabeth was acutely aware of his body pressed against hers, of the way he tried to minimize his weight on her, despite his obvious weakness. The preserve room was small, but dry, with shelves lined with canned goods and a narrow cot she'd used for storage. Elizabeth quickly moved boxes to make space, then helped Aiyana settle onto the cot with obvious relief. I will bring you food, she said, backing toward the door, and dry clothes. I still have some of James's things. Elizabeth, his voice stopped her at the threshold. Yes? Thank you. I know the danger you take for me. She met his gaze steadily. You would do the same. How do you know this? Because, she said softly, I see it in your eyes. Whatever else you are, you're a good man. As she closed the door and headed to the kitchen, Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she began preparing a meal. What was she doing? In the space of a few hours, she'd gone from respectable widow to harborer of her community's most feared enemy. If anyone discovered Aiyana here, she could be arrested, driven from her land, or worse. But as she sliced bread and ladled soup into a bowl, she found she couldn't regret her choice. For the first time since James's death, she felt truly alive, as if some part of her that had gone dormant was awakening. It was dangerous, perhaps even foolish, but it felt right in a way that defied all logic. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the walls of her home, something fragile and unprecedented was taking root. 2 wounded souls finding solace in the most unlikely of places, even as the world around them remained hostile to any possibility of understanding between their peoples. Elizabeth arranged the meal on a tray, added a cup of hot coffee, and headed back to the preserve room. Whatever happened next, she was committed now to seeing this through wherever it might lead. 5 days had passed since Elizabeth had moved Aiyana into the preserve room, and a careful routine had developed between them. She would bring him meals at dawn and dusk, when the risk of being observed was lowest, and spend increasingly longer periods in quiet conversation that bridged their vastly different worlds. This morning she found him sitting up on the cot, his color much improved and his eyes alert. James's spare shirt hung loose on his frame, but the trousers fit reasonably well. Seeing him in her late husband's clothes stirred complicated emotions she wasn't ready to examine. "Your shoulder is healing well," she observed, setting down a tray of eggs, bacon, and fresh bread. "How does it feel?" "Much better. Your care," he searched for the right English words. "It has great skill." Elizabeth felt warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. "You're a strong man. Your body wants to heal." As he ate, she noticed him watching her with curious eyes. Finally, he spoke. "You are not like the other white women I have seen." "What do you mean?" "In town, when I would trade furs, I saw them. They would cross the street, hold their children close. Fear lived in their faces when they looked at us." He took a careful bite of bread. "But you sit here as if we were old friends." Elizabeth considered his words. "Maybe because I've been alone so long, I've forgotten to be properly afraid. Or maybe I never learned the right kind of fear. There is no right fear. Fear is fear." "You're not what I expected an Apache warrior to be," she admitted, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "The stories we hear." "What stories?" "That your people are savage, bloodthirsty, that you scalp women and steal children." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I know now how foolish that sounds." Aiyana's expression grew serious. "Some stories have truth. There are warriors among my people who have done terrible things, just as there are soldiers among yours who have done the same." He met her eyes directly. "But we fight because we are pushed from our lands, our children killed, our sacred places destroyed. What would your people do if strangers came and tried to take everything you loved?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications Elizabeth had never considered. "We would fight," she said quietly. "Yes, and some would call you savage for defending what was yours." She absorbed this, feeling her understanding of the world shifting in uncomfortable ways. "How did you learn to speak English so well?" "There was a missionary, Father Miguel, who came to our mountains when I was young. He wanted to teach us about his God, but he also shared his language. My father said knowledge was power, that understanding our enemies might help us survive." "Did you believe in his God?" Aiyana smiled, the expression transforming his face completely. "I believe there is one creator, but he speaks to all people in their own language. The missionary's God and our creator, perhaps they are the same, wearing different faces." Elizabeth found herself drawn to this philosophy, so different from the rigid certainty of her childhood church. "That's a beautiful way to think about it." "And you? What do you believe?" The question caught her off guard. Since James's death, she'd struggled with faith, angry at a God who would take away the one person who made her feel whole. "I used to believe in a loving God who protected good people, but lately," she trailed off, unsure how to voice her doubts. "Lately, you wonder why good people suffer while evil ones prosper." "Yes," the word came out as barely a whisper. "My people say that the Creator gives us challenges to make our spirits stronger. Perhaps your God thinks the same, or perhaps there is no God at all, and we're all just stumbling around in the dark, trying to make sense of senseless things." Aiyana studied her face with those penetrating dark eyes. "You have great sadness in your heart. Don't we all?" "Yes, but yours is different. It is not just grief for your husband. It is, how do I say, like a flower trying to bloom in winter." The metaphor struck her as unexpectedly perceptive. "What do you mean?" "You are a woman who was meant to love deeply, to create life, to nurture. But the world has given you only loss and loneliness. So part of you," he gestured vaguely, "sleeps, waiting for spring." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever seen her so clearly, understood her so completely. "How can you know that?" "Because I recognize it. The same winter lives in my heart since Desba and Nalnish died." She set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "Sometimes I think I'll never feel truly alive again." "And sometimes?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibility. Elizabeth looked at this man who should have been her enemy, who had somehow become her confidant, and felt something stir in her chest that she'd thought buried forever. "Sometimes," she whispered, "I think maybe I could." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Elizabeth felt her breath catch. There was something building between them, an awareness that went beyond gratitude or simple human kindness. It was dangerous territory, forbidden by every law of society and survival. A sudden noise from outside, horses approaching at a gallop, shattered the moment. Elizabeth leaped to her feet, her heart hammering with panic. "Stay here," she whispered urgently. "Don't make any noise." She hurried to the front window and peered through the curtains. 3 riders were approaching, Sheriff Morrison and 2 men she didn't recognize, though their military bearings suggested cavalry. Her blood turned to ice. The knock on her door was firm, authoritative. Elizabeth smoothed her skirts, took a deep breath and opened it with what she hoped was a welcoming smile. "Sheriff Morrison? What a surprise. What brings you out in this heat?" Morrison tipped his hat, his weathered face serious. "Mrs. McKenna, these are Captain Bradley and Sergeant Walsh from Fort Apache. We're tracking a dangerous Apache warrior who escaped after the recent action up in the Dragoons." "Oh my," Elizabeth said, hoping her voice sounded appropriately shocked. "How frightening." Captain Bradley stepped forward, a tall man with cold blue eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe he may be in this area. Have you seen any signs of Indian activity? Tracks, missing livestock, anything unusual?" Elizabeth's mind raced. "No, nothing like that, though I have to admit I don't venture far from the house alone anymore. Not since James—" "Of course," Morrison said with gruff sympathy. "But you'd tell us if you saw anything, wouldn't you, Elizabeth? This particular Indian is extremely dangerous. He's killed 3 soldiers and wounded 2 others." Behind the preserve room door, mere yards away, Aiyana was undoubtedly hearing every word. Elizabeth wondered what he thought about being described as a killer, if it matched the gentle man who had compared her to a flower waiting for spring. "Naturally, I'd report anything suspicious immediately," she said, the lie coming easier than she'd expected. "But truly, I've seen nothing." Sergeant Walsh, a younger man with suspicious eyes, stepped closer. "Mind if we take a look around your property, ma'am? Just to be thorough." Elizabeth's heart nearly stopped, but she kept her expression calm. "Of course not. Though I should warn you, I've got preserves stored in the small room off the kitchen that smell quite strongly of vinegar. Pickled vegetables, you understand?" It was a desperate gambit, meant to explain any unusual odors they might detect, but Captain Bradley just nodded. "We understand, ma'am. This won't take long." As the 3 men began their search, Elizabeth followed at a careful distance, her palms sweating despite the desert heat. They examined the barn thoroughly, checking every stall and corner where a man might hide. They investigated the chicken coop, the root cellar, even the outhouse. Finally, they approached the house itself. Elizabeth's mouth went dry as they entered the kitchen, so close to where Aiyana waited in silence. "Smells like you've been doing quite a bit of preserving," Sheriff Morrison observed, sniffing the air. "Yes. Well, it's that time of year," Elizabeth managed. Captain Bradley moved toward the preserve room door, and Elizabeth felt the world narrow to a single point of terror. His hand was on the doorknob when Sergeant Walsh called out from the front room. "Captain, you should see this." Bradley released the doorknob and strode away. Elizabeth nearly collapsed with relief. The sergeant was holding James's rifle, which she'd left leaning against the fireplace. "Fine weapon, ma'am. Your husband's?" "Yes, I keep it for protection." "Smart woman," Captain Bradley said approvingly. "An Apache warrior is nothing to take lightly." After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the search concluded. The 3 men gathered in her front yard, apparently satisfied. "We're sorry to have disturbed you, Mrs. McKenna," Captain Bradley said, "but if you see anything at all, I'll send word immediately," Elizabeth promised. As they rode away, Elizabeth remained at the window until they disappeared over the horizon. Only then did she allow herself to collapse into a chair, her entire body shaking with reaction. A soft knock came from the preserve room door. She opened it to find Aiyana standing there, his face grave. "They called me a killer," he said quietly. "Are you?" He met her eyes steadily. "I have killed, yes. 3 soldiers who were shooting at women and children in our camp. But I did not murder innocents, if that is what you ask." Elizabeth studied his face and found she believed him completely. "I'm glad. You protected me. Why?" The question she'd been avoiding even in her own thoughts. Why had she lied to the law, risked everything for a man she barely knew? "Because," she said slowly, "I don't think you're my enemy, and I don't think I'm yours." Aiyana stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "No," he said softly, "you are not my enemy, Elizabeth McKenna." The way he said her name, with that slight accent that made it sound like music, sent warmth spiraling through her chest. They stood there for a moment, the magnitude of what she'd just done settling between them. She had crossed a line now, made herself complicit in harboring a fugitive. There would be no going back to her simple life of grief and solitude. Whether she'd saved them both or doomed them remained to be seen. The cavalry's visit had changed everything. Over the next week, Elizabeth found herself constantly watching the horizon, jumping at every unusual sound. But it wasn't just fear that kept her on edge. It was the growing awareness of Aiyana's presence in her home, the way her pulse quickened whenever she brought him meals, the forbidden thoughts that crept into her mind during the long, lonely evenings. On the 8th night after the search, she found him sitting outside the preserve room in her kitchen, his shoulder now strong enough to allow him greater movement. He'd been helping with small tasks around the house, mending tools, fixing a loose board in the floor, always careful to stay hidden from view of the windows. "You should be resting," she said, though she made no move to send him back to his room. "I am tired of being hidden like a wounded animal," he replied, his voice carrying a frustration she hadn't heard before. "And you look tired too." Elizabeth sank into the chair across from him at her small kitchen table. She did feel tired, bone-deep weary from the constant vigilance, the weight of her secret, the emotional turmoil of her growing feelings for this man who could never truly belong in her world. "Sometimes I wonder what I've gotten myself into," she admitted. "You regret helping me?" It wasn't a question, and she heard the resignation in his voice. "No," she said quickly. "No, I don't regret it. I don't know what happens next." Aiyana leaned forward, his dark eyes intense in the lamplight. "I will leave soon. My strength has returned and I have put you in enough danger." The thought of him leaving hit her like a physical blow. "Where will you go?" "North, to the mountains. There are others of my people there, scattered bands who have not yet been captured or killed." "And then what? You'll keep running forever?" "What choice do I have? Your government will not stop hunting us until we are all dead or locked away on reservations like cattle." The bitterness in his voice made her chest ache. "There has to be another way. Tell me what way, Elizabeth. Tell me how an Apache warrior and a white widow can exist in the same world without bringing destruction to everything around them." The question hung between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond simple survival. Elizabeth met his gaze and saw her own impossible longing reflected there. "I don't know," she whispered. "Neither do I." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken desires filling the space between them. Finally, Aiyana reached across the table and gently touched her hand. The contact sent warmth shooting up her arm. "But I know this," he said softly. "These days with you, they have given me something I thought I would never feel again." "What's that?" "Hope, peace, the possibility that there might be beauty left in the world." Elizabeth turned her hand over, palm up, and felt his fingers intertwine with hers. "You've given me the same thing." "Elizabeth," his voice was rough with emotion. "I know we can't. I know this is impossible." The words came out in a rush. "But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just kindness or charity. And what do you feel?" She looked into his eyes, those beautiful dark eyes that had haunted her dreams, and threw caution to the wind. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The admission hung in the air like a live wire. Aiyana's grip on her hand tightened, and she saw something flare in his expression. Desire, hope, and anguish all tangled together. "You cannot love me," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" "Because I am Apache. Because your people would rather see you dead than in love with one of mine. Because there is no future for us. Maybe there could be. Where?" The question came out harsh, desperate. Where in this territory, this country, this world, could an Apache warrior and a white woman build a life together? Elizabeth had no answer for that because she knew he was right, but her heart refused to accept the impossibility of it. "I don't know," she said again, "but I know that what we have right now in this moment, it's real, it's precious, and it's worth something, even if it can't last forever." Aiyana stood abruptly, pulling his hand away, and began pacing the small kitchen like a caged wolf. "You do not understand what you are saying. If anyone discovered your feelings, if they even suspected, they would run me out of the territory or worse," Elizabeth finished. "I know the risks. Then why speak of love? Why make this harder than it already is?" Elizabeth rose and moved to stand in front of him, stopping his restless pacing. "Because pretending doesn't make the feelings go away. Because I've spent 3 months feeling dead inside, and you've made me feel alive again. Because sometimes truth is more important than safety." Aiyana stared down at her, his breathing ragged. "Elizabeth, you are asking me to want things I cannot have." "I'm not asking you anything. I'm just telling you how I feel. And if I tell you that I feel the same, if I admit that every moment in your presence is both joy and torture, What then? Her heart soared even as her mind recoiled from the implications. Then we'll figure it out somehow. There is no somehow. There is only pain and death waiting at the end of this path. Maybe. Or maybe there's something else. Something we can't see yet. Aiyana cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the intensity in his eyes. You beautiful, foolish woman. Do you know what you are asking of the world? I'm asking for the right to love who I choose. And I am asking for the right to love you without it destroying us both. The admission broke down the last of her reserves. Elizabeth rose on her toes and kissed him, a soft, tentative touch that spoke of all the longing she'd been fighting. For a moment he stood frozen. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close as he deepened the kiss with a passion that made her knees weak. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Aiyana rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. This is madness, he whispered. Yes, it will bring nothing but heartbreak, probably. And still you want it? Elizabeth looked up into his face, memorizing every detail, the sharp cheekbones, the strong jaw, the eyes that held depths of pain and tenderness. I want you whatever the cost. Elizabeth, her name was a prayer on his lips. A sudden sound outside, the distant thunder of approaching horses, shattered the moment. Both froze, listening. The sound grew closer, multiple riders moving fast in the darkness. The cavalry, Elizabeth breathed, terror flooding her system. No. Aiyana moved to the window, peering carefully through a gap in the curtains. Worse, your neighbors. Elizabeth joined him at the window and felt her blood turn to ice. 5 riders approached at a gallop, Sheriff Morrison, Captain Bradley, and 3 men she recognized as local ranchers, Tom Henderson, Bill Carter, and Frank Walsh. All were armed, and even in the dim moonlight she could see the grim determination on their faces. They know, she whispered. Someone must have seen something, or grown suspicious about the cavalry's visit. Aiyana turned from the window, his face set in hard lines. I have to run. Where? They'll see you the moment you leave the house. Then I fight. No! Elizabeth grabbed his arm. There are 5 of them, and you're still healing. I will not hide behind you anymore, Elizabeth. I will not let them hurt you because of me. The riders were close enough now that she could hear their voices, rough and angry. Sheriff Morrison was shouting orders, deploying the men around the house. Elizabeth McKenna, Captain Bradley's voice boomed across the yard. We know you're harboring a fugitive. Send him out and you won't be harmed. Elizabeth and Aiyana stared at each other, both knowing this was the end of their impossible dream. Whatever had grown between them over these precious days was about to be destroyed by the harsh realities of their world. I love you, she whispered urgently. And I love you, he replied, more than my own life. Mrs. McKenna, Sheriff Morrison's voice now closer to the house. You have 1 minute to send him out or we're coming in. Aiyana moved toward the back door, but Elizabeth caught his hand. Wait, she said, an idea forming in her desperate mind. The root cellar. It has a tunnel that leads to the creek bed. James dug it during the Apache troubles last year. You could... Elizabeth McKenna! The voice was right outside now. Time's up. The front door exploded inward as the men burst into her home, rifles ready. Elizabeth stood alone in the kitchen, her heart pounding as 5 armed men filled her small space. Where is he? Captain Bradley demanded, his cold eyes scanning the room. I don't know what you're talking about, Elizabeth said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Don't lie to us, Elizabeth, Sheriff Morrison said, his tone almost pleading. Mrs. Patterson saw smoke from your chimney at odd hours, caught a glimpse of someone moving around who wasn't you. We know he's here. Tom Henderson stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. That murdering savage has been hiding in your house, hasn't he? What did he do to you, Elizabeth? Threaten to scalp you if you didn't help? No one threatened me, Elizabeth said firmly. Then you helped him willingly? Captain Bradley's voice was deadly quiet. Elizabeth lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with defiant pride. Yes. The admission seemed to shock them all into momentary silence. Then Tom Henderson exploded. You treacherous bitch! You've been harboring the enemy while good men risked their lives hunting him. That's enough, Tom, Sheriff Morrison warned, but his own face was pale with disappointment. Search the house, Captain Bradley ordered. Tear it apart if you have to. As the men spread out to ransack her home, Elizabeth stood motionless in the center of her kitchen, praying that Aiyana had made it to the tunnel, that somehow this nightmare would end without more bloodshed. But in her heart, she knew their time had run out. Whatever happened next, Their brief moment of impossible love was over, and the real world was about to exact its price for their forbidden feelings. The search lasted 3 agonizing hours. Elizabeth watched helplessly as the men destroyed her home, overturning furniture, smashing her preserves, tearing through her personal belongings with ruthless efficiency. They found the preserve room where Aiyana had hidden, discovered the makeshift bed, and evidence of recent occupation, but the man himself had vanished. "He was here," Captain Bradley said grimly, holding up one of James's shirts that still carried Aiyana's scent. "Recently." "The tunnel," Sheriff Morrison said suddenly, emerging from the root cellar with dirt on his uniform. "There's a tunnel that leads to the creek. He must have—" "Get the dogs!" Captain Bradley barked to Sergeant Walsh. "We'll track him." As the men prepared for pursuit, Tom Henderson grabbed Elizabeth's arm roughly. "You've aided a killer, Elizabeth. A savage who murdered good Christian soldiers." "Get your hands off me," Elizabeth said coldly, jerking free. "So you're coming with us," Captain Bradley announced. "You'll face charges of treason and aiding the enemy." "On what authority?" "Martial law gives me all the authority I need." His blue eyes were ice cold. "You'll be held at Fort Apache pending trial." Elizabeth felt the walls of her world closing in, but she kept her chin high. Whatever happened to her now, she didn't regret helping Aiyana. She couldn't regret love, even if it cost her everything. As they bound her hands and prepared to leave, the sound of gunfire erupted from the creek bed. Elizabeth's heart lurched with terror. "We got him!" someone shouted in the distance. "No," Elizabeth whispered, struggling against her bonds. More shots rang out, followed by shouts and the sound of horses crashing through brush. Elizabeth strained to hear over the noise of her captors, desperate for any sign that Aiyana might have escaped. After what felt like an eternity, Sergeant Walsh appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "He got away, sir. Wounded one of our men and disappeared into the rocks. Dogs lost his scent at the water." Relief flooded through Elizabeth so powerfully she nearly collapsed. He was alive, he was free. "Damn," Captain Bradley muttered. "Double the patrols. He can't have gotten far." As they dragged Elizabeth outside, she caught sight of the destruction they'd wrought. Her garden was trampled, her chicken coop destroyed, her home violated and ruined. But none of that mattered compared to the knowledge that Aiyana had escaped. The ride to Fort Apache took 2 days, during which Elizabeth was treated as a prisoner, hands bound, allowed minimal food and water, subjected to suspicious glares and muttered curses from her captors. At night, they chained her to a tree like a common criminal. Fort Apache was a harsh collection of adobe buildings, surrounded by high walls, designed to project military might into the heart of Apache territory. Elizabeth was placed in a small cell, normally used for deserters and troublemakers, with only a narrow window and a straw mattress for comfort. For 3 weeks she languished in confinement, while preparations were made for her trial. The charges were serious: treason, aiding and abetting the enemy, obstruction of military justice. Captain Bradley made it clear that she could face execution if convicted. During her imprisonment, she received only 2 visitors. The first was Sheriff Morrison, who came on a sweltering afternoon looking deeply uncomfortable. "Elizabeth," he said, settling heavily onto the wooden stool outside her cell, "I've known you since you were Tom Patterson's girl, before you married James. I can't understand how you got mixed up in this." "I helped a wounded man," Elizabeth said simply. "Nothing more complicated than that. A wounded Apache warrior who killed 3 soldiers. A wounded human being who had lost everything he loved, just like I had." Morrison shook his graying head. "You're talking about love, aren't you?" "Good God, Elizabeth, tell me you didn't. Tell me you weren't." "What I felt is between me and God," Elizabeth replied firmly. "The prosecutor is pushing for the death penalty. Your only chance is to claim you were coerced, that he threatened you. I won't lie. Then you're determined to die for this." Elizabeth looked out through the barred window at the harsh desert landscape beyond the fort's walls. Somewhere out there, Aiyana was alive and free. That knowledge sustained her more than food or water. "If that's the price of refusing to betray someone I care about, then yes." Morrison left, shaking his head, and Elizabeth knew she'd lost whatever sympathy he might have offered. Her second visitor came on the eve of her trial, Father Miguel, the elderly Mexican priest who served as chaplain to the fort. He was a small man with kind eyes and work-worn hands, and something about him seemed familiar. "Senora McKenna," he said gently, settling onto the stool, "I have come to offer comfort before your trial. Thank you, Father, but I'm at peace with my choices." "Are you?" He studied her face carefully. "Or are you simply resigned to suffering for love?" Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. Do we know each other, Father? In a way, see. I once knew a young Apache man who spoke often of a white woman who showed him great kindness. He called her his angel. Elizabeth's breath caught. Aiyana. He survived his escape, though he was wounded again in the attempt. He made his way north to the mountains where friends of mine helped tend his injuries. Is he? He heals. In body, at least, his heart. Father Miguel shrugged expressively. That is another matter. You've spoken with him? See, he is consumed with guilt over what has happened to you. He blames himself for your imprisonment. He shouldn't. I made my own choices. That is what I told him. But guilt is not always reasonable, no? The priest leaned closer. Senora, he wishes to surrender himself, to trade his freedom for yours. No. Elizabeth gripped the bars of her cell. You can't let him do that. They'll hang him. That is what I told him, but love, like guilt, is not always reasonable. Father, please, you have to convince him. My life isn't worth more than his. Perhaps neither of your lives is worth as much as what you represent together. Elizabeth frowned. What do you mean? Father Miguel was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words. There are those among both our peoples who believe that understanding between Apache and white is possible, that love can bridge even the deepest hatreds. You and Aiyana, you have proven this is true. And where has it gotten us? I'm facing execution, and he's hunted like an animal. Sometimes the seeds of change are planted in sorrow and watered with sacrifice. Sometimes lovers become symbols of what could be, even if they cannot live to see it themselves. Cold comfort, Father. Perhaps, but not meaningless comfort. The trial began the next morning in the fort's main hall, hastily converted into a courtroom. Captain Bradley served as both prosecutor and primary witness, painting Elizabeth as a traitor who had endangered every settler in the territory by harboring a dangerous enemy. Elizabeth's assigned defense attorney, a young lieutenant named Pierce, did his best with an impossible case. He argued that she was a grieving widow who had acted out of misguided charity, not treasonous intent. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Elizabeth's own refusal to claim coercion made his job nearly impossible. On the second day of trial, as Captain Bradley described the military necessity of hunting down Apache fugitives, a commotion erupted outside the hall. Shouting voices, the sound of horses, urgent calls for the captain. The doors burst open, and Sergeant Walsh stumbled in, blood streaming from a head wound. "Captain," he gasped, "we're under attack. Apache war party hit the supply train 5 miles out. They've got our ammunition and medical supplies." Chaos erupted in the courtroom as officers rushed to respond to the crisis. In the confusion, Elizabeth noticed Father Miguel slip quietly from the hall. The trial was suspended as the fort prepared for possible siege. Elizabeth was returned to her cell, but the usual guards were reassigned to defensive positions, leaving only an elderly corporal to watch the prisoners. As night fell, Elizabeth heard soft footsteps approaching her cell. She looked up to see a figure in Apache dress, face painted for war, moving like a shadow through the darkness. "Aiyana," she whispered. He stepped into the light, and her heart nearly stopped. The face paint couldn't disguise the man she loved, but his eyes held a hardness she hadn't seen before. "I have come for you," he said quietly, producing a set of keys. "How did you—" "Father Miguel. He believes as I do that love should not die in cages. The attack on the supply train— a diversion. My friends risk much for this chance." He unlocked her cell, and Elizabeth stepped out into freedom she'd never expected to taste again. "Aiyana, this is madness. They'll hunt us both now. Then we will run together. North to Canada perhaps, or south to Mexico, somewhere we can live as we choose. And if they catch us, then we die together instead of apart." Elizabeth looked into his eyes and saw her own desperate hope reflected there. It was impossible, hopeless, probably doomed, but it was a chance. "What about your people? Won't they resent you bringing a white woman among them?" "Some will. Others remember that love is sacred no matter what form it takes." He cupped her face gently. "And you are not just any white woman. You are the woman who risked everything to save an enemy. That means something to my people. And yours? Your family? Your friends? Dead or scattered. But there are good people among both our races, Elizabeth. People who believe peace is possible. We could help build bridges between our worlds. Or we could die trying." "Yes," he agreed. "But we would die as ourselves, not as the roles others have forced upon us." Elizabeth thought of her destroyed home, her ruined reputation, the certain death that awaited her if she remained. Then she thought of this man who had shown her what love could be, who had awakened her heart when she'd thought it permanently frozen. "Lead the way," she said. They slipped from the fort like ghosts, moving through shadows toward the horses Aiyana had waiting beyond the walls. Behind them, the sounds of military preparation continued, soldiers rushing to defend against an attack that was already withdrawing into the desert. As they rode hard toward the mountains under a canopy of brilliant stars, Elizabeth felt truly free for the first time in her life. Free to love whom she chose, free to write her own story, free to discover what lay beyond the boundaries others had set for her. The future was uncertain, dangerous, probably short, but it would be theirs, lived on their own terms, bound together by a love that had already proven stronger than law, custom, or fear. Behind them, Fort Apache grew smaller in the distance. Ahead lay the vast desert, beautiful and terrible, holding the promise of either death or a new kind of life altogether. Either way, they would face it together.